Let's do it. So welcome back. Hope you all had a nice Christmas break. We are gonna jump right into it here with a whole new set of challenging questions from our group. And as usual, we'll keep on going until we run out of questions. So if you have any new questions that come up as time goes on, please feel free to get those to me. I just got one yesterday from somebody, and it's an amazing question. The question is, where does the concept of baptism come from? So we're going to talk about that and the history of baptism at some point. So any questions are always welcome. Happy to have them. Today's question is, why was Jesus born a Jew? We're going to talk about that today. As usual, we start with our assumptions, and I think that we have a lot of assumptions when it comes to this question. I want to start with thinking about what it means to be Jewish. You know, how do you decide if somebody is Jewish, or how do you decide if you are Jewish? And I think that isn't as a particularly straightforward question as it might seem to be. Any thoughts on that? How do you figure out if you're Jewish or not?
Your family, your religion, your place of birth, those all don't count necessarily, but they would work into it, wouldn't they?
Mm-hmm. In some ways.
Yeah, the genealogy, I mean, you can be born a Jew without being born in Israel, for instance,
Yep.
for example.
Yep.
So it's not exactly a nationality. I guess it's passed down through the mother.
Typically, yep. Today, that's kind of how it's done. If your mother's Jewish, then you are at least culturally Jewish.
Yes.
So if your dad's Jewish, your mother isn't, does that make a difference?
Yes, it does. In some circles, then you're not considered to be officially Jewish. And if you want to be Jewish, you have to convert, because you're not a naturalized Jew. You aren't born into it.
We had a foreign exchange a few years ago, and she found it really odd that we had all this, emphasis on our ancestry, because where she came from in the Czech Republic, they've just always been there for as far as she knows, whereas we are not in that position. So it's kind of a different question depending on where you are in the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so some places, being Jewish is an ethnic thing, kind of a national thing. And sometimes it's been that.
Right.
The religion that you practice. I follow a rabbi on Twitter who was born into a Christian family and went to seminary, and then later in life converted to Judaism and is now a rabbi who teaches classes on the basics of Judaism via Zoom. And so she is not ethnically or nationally or I guess not. That's not true. And she was not originally culturally or religiously Jewish, but through her conversion experience, she now practices the religion of Judaism, and she engages in the culture of Judaism. And so it's kind of a chosen identity for her, whereas other people, are born into a particular circumstance where they get this label Jewish, and maybe they don't even practice any of the religious traditions of Judaism. Some of the culture maybe, or maybe not, depending on what their family grew up with. But ethnically, technically, based on the way that the identity is passed down, they are Jewish. So the way that we determine who is a Jew is a very tricky subject. And so I just want to warn us, and especially myself, as we're having this conversation, that as non-Jews, I don't claim to be Jewish through any of these means or any other means. I think we need to tread carefully with a topic like this, because Jesus certainly was Jewish as a human on earth, but what it means to be Jewish, I think, is important, and it plays an important part in asking this question and as part of the assumptions that we bring. So I wanted to start there. But then the next question I think we should need to ask is, who is Jesus? What do we know about this guy and his relationship, to Judaism? And I think at the most basic, we can say that he's Jewish because he was born the son of an unmarried Jewish peasant girl. And so why was Jesus born a Jew? The easy answer is because his mother is Jewish. I'm not going to stop there, obviously, but that's a basic place to start, because I think there's more to it than that, right? And
Well,
so
yeah.
I think we need to interpret Jesus' life through the lens of his Judaism. There may be a different but kind of related question: what are the implications of Jesus' Jewishness? What does it mean that Jesus was born a Jew? Not just why, but what does it mean? And I think that has to do with God's intentions. I think we can assume that Jesus was born a Jew for a good reason. And so we need to grapple with what that good reason is. What is God's intention? Why did God choose to have Jesus be born a Jew? I think is kind of a related question that we need to keep in mind as we're moving through this. So any other thoughts about our assumptions and preliminaries before we hop into working toward an answer?
What's the link then with the lineage of David? I mean, they don't track Jesus through Mary.
Nope.
Even though that's how he became a Jew.
Yep. Interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
But then actually Joseph was just his stepdad.
Yeah, if you take all those stories and combine them together like we do in our Gospels, then the lineage that is given, both of them that are different, we looked at that in December, both of them trace to Joseph, who he technically has no blood relationship with. If we accept the idea of the virgin birth and the fact that kind of God is Jesus' father, which is interesting. So there's this sense that because he was born to a Jewish peasant girl, he is ethnically Jewish. Because he was raised by a Jewish father, he is religiously and culturally Jewish. That connects him in some way to the lineage of Judaism and God's people. So it's a very complicated question.
Very complicated.
Told you we were just going to hop right in.
Actually, it's the answers that are complicated. The question's pretty straightforward.
Oh, this is a slam dunk.
So we can just quit there if you want and just go with that. But I have some other things that I can say about this if you want to stick around. So I think what we have to do in order to understand this a little bit is we need to think a little bit about what God's relationship has been to the Jewish people. And that we can trace all the way back to creation. So I want to just take a couple of stops along the way in the history of the Jewish people and their relationship with God, and make some notes and think about what those events mean. So what I did was I went through and I actually used a Bible translation called the Complete Jewish Bible, which is a paraphrase of the Jewish Publication Society's original translation from Hebrew into English. And so this is going to seem familiar to you, but there's going to be some elements to the translations that are a little bit different. And the reason I did this was because I wanted to get as close as possible to taking this from, from the perspective of Judaism, and not put in, not read in our Christian interpretations too much, because we're trying to, let this kind of be what it is on its face in this relationship of the Jewish people to God. So according to the Complete Jewish Bible, Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 to 28 says, and I have a couple more things to say that I didn't put on the screen, so that's what the ... is. So you'll pick up with me as you read along when I get toward the end. Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, in the likeness of ourselves, and let them rule over the fishes in the sea, the birds in the air, the animals, and over all the earth, and over every crawling creature that crawls on the earth." So God created humankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them. God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea, the birds in the air, and every living creature that crawls on the earth." So this is the initial establishment of God's relationship with the Jewish people. And so I wanted to give you some understanding of how Jewish people read the creation story. And so a lot of my notes for this and the next several slides are going to come from lectures that I experienced with Dr. Stephen Stern at Gettysburg College. He is he was at the time the assistant professor for Jewish studies at Gettysburg College, and I took a couple classes with him. And so he explained to us that from a Jewish perspective, in creation, God says that everything is good. God does not say that everything is perfect. And the reason why God doesn't say it's perfect is because God creates humans to help perfect the world. That humans have a role to play in improving this world that God has created. God could have created it perfect. God is perfect, but God chose to make it good so that there is somewhere to go with it. It kind of reminds me of when Bob and I were visiting Reading, when we were driving around with our realtor, and he got really excited to show us some of the areas of Reading that he doesn't typically get to show his prospective buyers. He took us out to show us Keswick. He took us through some of the areas over off of 273 where it's a little seedier than in other areas. And the reason he did that was because he knew that as people who were coming to serve with a church, we weren't looking to come to a place that was already perfect and had everything going for it. We are trying to do ministry. And if you don't have anybody who is in need, if you don't have anything that's wrong, then there's really nothing to do. And then you have no purpose. And so for at least for the strain of Judaism that Dr. Stern follows, creating the creation as good but not as perfect is actually one of God's blessings for us, because it gives us purpose, it gives us meaning in our lives. And so therefore, God created humans to be in partnership with God. God has expectations for humans, but humans have moral freedom. We get to choose how we're going to respond and how we're going to behave in the world. But when you use your moral freedom to make choices that are not good for you, not good for others, then that's where suffering comes from. In the story of the fall, it says that after Adam and Eve ate the fruit, they hid themselves. And so God came and said, "Where are you?" And according to Dr. Stern, that the interpretation of that question is not, "I don't know where you are, why are you hiding from me?" It's to let them know that even though they have made this bad choice, even though that they've experienced this failure, God is still pursuing a relationship with them. That part of the real part of a relationship with God is failure, is making mistakes, is learning and growing, and that moral development. And so this passage here that I just read to you for Jews is the first commandment. There are 613 commandments in the Old Testament according to the Jewish count, and this is commandment number 1: be fruitful and multiply. And the reason for that is because having children invests you in the future. If you're invested in something outside of yourself, that means that you no longer get to choose ethical indifference. You have to make choices, and you use those choices for good or ill. And understanding that kind of parental commitment allows us to see God's relationship to us in miniature, and in of course an inferior way, but to help us to understand that moral development means making mistakes. It means that we will experience natural punishments. It means that according to some strains of Judaism, God will punish without not allowing just natural consequences, but providing additional consequences. And so the first commandment, be fruitful and multiply, is about establishing that relationship with the person, the individual human, and God, but also with the person and the other, that we have this responsibility to each other. We are commanded to be social creatures. We are commanded to have an interest outside of ourselves, and not just in our own children because they are from us, but in others as well, by implication. So questions about that?
Well, that certainly explains why we're in the fix we're in now.
It seems to me like there's a lot of, I just want to take care of myself and I don't care about everybody else.
There's a lot of that. Yeah. Or I want freedom for what I want, not my group, not my country, not my community.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Other thoughts? All right. So let's move on now to step 2. So creation, God establishes that relationship with all people, and wants that relationship, wants that moral development, wants that wants that blessing of giving purpose and meaning and positive interconnectedness. But as we know, the fall happens, the people disperse through Babel. We've got the flood because everything is going so terribly that God decides to kind of start over. All of these things happen, and so God kind of pivots. God isn't making a new choice in terms of a changing of the mind. This is kind of a new approach to accomplish the same goal. And so we come to the story of the person that we call Abraham, or Abram. In the Jewish Bible, it's transliterated Avram. And so we have Genesis chapter 12. Now Adonai is the Jewish word for God, Lord. Now Adonai said to Avram, "Get yourself out of your country, away from your kinsmen and away from your father's house, and go to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you are to be a blessing." So Abraham and Sarah leave their traditions, their positions, traditionally within a Jewish context. Abraham was understood to be an aristocrat. He had a lot of money. He had a lot of clout in his community. So he wasn't just being asked to leave something that he didn't have a lot of investment in. He was really a central member of the community. And according to tradition, Sarah was actually a princess in in the community. And so Abraham had kind of, won the lottery when he got to marry her, until of course they found out that she was barren. But they had these positions that they had to give up. They had to give up, who they are, their connections, their identities, in order to start this new community, make different ethical choices that align with what God wants, rather than what they want, rather than what the society that they have been part of have wanted. And so for Jewish interpreters, this kind of indicates that biblical ethics are about what my obligation to you, my concern for you is my obligation, even if you have no concern for me. Judaism is about the other. And so even if you treat me terribly, even if you're not fulfilling your obligation to me, I still have that obligation to have concern for you, to have care for you above myself. And that's part of that call, because here it says, why is Abram being called out? To be made great, to become a great nation, so that he could be a blessing to others. God is not just saying, I choose you, Abraham, you're going to be my person, I'm going to give all the blessings to you, and those are going to be for you, and you're going to be better than everybody else. The purpose, the reason why God chooses Abraham and his descendants is because through them, the blessing will be spread to others. And so Judaism is always about reaching out. It's always about pushing out that blessing to other people. Questions or comments about that?
That's interesting.
It
The
seems like
whole-
general society has kind of lost some of that thought process, or the belief that you should take care of others.
For sure.
And it's said over and over and over again. I mean, this is one way that God's told us, but it's over and over and over again in the things that he does and says to us. I don't understand how we've gotten so far off that track.
I can think about the people that are supposed to be doing it. We're selfish.
Yeah, that's true. But
you know what? If you don't take care of the community, you're not taking care of yourself either,
No.
because you're part of it.
At the end of the day,
but
you come to that conclusion.
he picked Abraham, who had a lot of money and a lot of land and prestige and everything. And then Jesus had nothing, I mean, it's kind of strange. This is a strange story, Katie.
How come we're sticking with it?
That's
Okay,
why
so
it's because it's so fun. If it wasn't strange and weird and full of oddities, then we would get bored with it.
on the other hand, it's interesting that in the story, God picked two people who had great standing and wealth and whatever, and they went out on their own and proved that they were really strong, good people on their own. They didn't need that familial blessing on them. They made it on their own and did what was right.
Did they? I feel
I
like
guess.
Abraham and Sarah are not great. Like I don't think I would want my
But
kids.
we're
to pick
still
them as
talking
role
about them,
models.
Katie. We're
Huh?
still talking about them.
We
I
are
mean,
still
they went
talking
out-
about them.
It's been a while, so.
We're still talking about them, but I have some negative things to say, that's for sure. All right, well, let's see what we can come up with next year. So we've got God's relationship to the Jewish people now starts to develop out of this promise that has been made to Abraham. I will bless you so that you can be a blessing to others. And so we come through, the community grows, they end up in Egypt, they're enslaved. God delivers them out of Egypt and brings them to the mountain and gives them the law. And so this is Deuteronomy chapter 28. It's not the very end of Deuteronomy, but it's pretty close to the end. Moses is kind of, wrapping it up in terms of his time with the people, summarizing the law and making sure that they know what they need to do going forward. And so Moses says to the people, if you listen closely to what Adonai, your God, says, observing and obeying all his mitzvot, that's laws, which I am giving you today, Adonai, your God, will raise you on high above all the nations on earth, and all the following blessings will be yours in abundance if you will do what Adonai says. And then following that is a whole list of all the different blessings that God promises to give to the people for, if they do these things. So this stage in the development of God's relationship with the Jewish people, I think is heavily about the lesson that the past is what brings you to who you are today. Don't be ashamed of your past, understand your past, try to interpret your past to understand who you are today, but you have control over the future based on the choices that you make. You can choose to follow these rules that have been laid down for you. You can choose not to. But what your purpose is, what your goal is, how you will feel fulfilled and how you will feel that you are contributing to the world is by doing something new and different to make things better for everyone. And so that is what the law does. In the ancient Near East, a lot of the religions, a lot of the spirituality was cyclical, that things kept kind of circling back. The same things happened over and over and over. And that the spiritual imagination of people was kind of limited by that, because there was this sense that, the same things are always going to keep happening over and over and over and over. But God's law creates a religion that is historical rather than cyclical. There's a beginning, there's an ending. There's possibility for change. There's possibility for growth. There's possibility for having a role to play in making that future. You're not bound to a predetermined future. You get to be part of making that future. And you focus on the future that God controls, but you get to play a part in. And so with the emphasis on, on the fact that you can do something, then you should do something, right? You should use the creativity and free will that God has given you to fulfill that role, which is to bless the world, to make things better for everyone. And so this is kind of just a continuation. The law is just a continuation of the idea that God's relationship with the people that God has chosen is for the purpose of blessing the world. So all the law is the next step, the same, it's in the same thread, the same strain as that original promise that was made to Abraham, that through you, the world will be blessed. And so now it's, if you follow these laws, if you embody what the law says, then you will be able to participate in the creation of a better world, the perfection of the world. But of course, we're terrible at that and don't do what we're supposed to do. And so, oh, sorry, I didn't change my little tag at the top. This is supposed to say God's relationship to the Jewish people, the prophets. And so because over time, the people don't do what they're supposed to be doing, they don't understand the purpose of the law properly. They don't follow what God is asking them to do in terms of making relationships with others and projecting outward their concern for others and allowing others to show concern for them. And that's how they are raised up. The prophets come to make a statement, to point out what's wrong, what's going on, and to try to correct course. So there are tons and tons of examples of this in all the different prophets, but I chose to just pull up this passage from Amos chapter 2. This is a poem, but I didn't format it in poetry so that it would fit a little bit better on the screen. And it says, here is what Adonai says. For Israel's 3 crimes, no, 4, I will not reverse it. It being something along the lines of, my wrath, my punishment, because they sell the upright for silver and the poor for a pair of shoes, grinding the heads of the poor in the dust and pushing the lowly out of the way. And so this points to kind of that same idea. God's relationship to the Jewish people is about the Jewish people learning to have concern about the needs of society, using their freedom to support life rather than causing destruction because of their own self-interest and self-centeredness and selfish desires and choices. God has high expectations for these special people because the past experiences that they've had as a people and their future are interlocked. What God has accomplished for them and giving them those blessings of freedom and release and land and all the things that were promised to Abraham connects to that future where hopefully justice will prevail, where the world will look the way that God wants it to look, where that process of perfecting the goodness of creation can continue because people have finally come around to understanding what God's purpose is here. The prophets talk a lot about justice in their writing, and justice assumes a relationship. Justice requires that we relate to one another person to person, but it also requires that we relate to God, because God is the source of what justice means, the definition of justice, how justice should be meted out. But you can't have justice without that personal relationship with another human. It kind of then requires that you transfer your concern from yourself to the other. Again, that other-centered philosophy, that basis that it's not about me, it's about you. That God is involved in human life. We are God's agents in the world. God calls us to step out and be God's hands and voice, like we say on Sunday mornings, to the world. And we are that. That is our identity, whether we choose to fulfill that role or not. And so that's this developing relationship of the Jewish people with God, that they, as a people, according to the prophets, are not fulfilling this role properly. And the prophets demand a lot of creativity for this. They don't let people take the easy way out. They want you to take the most moral and ethical way out. They want you to solve problems in creative ways so that everybody has what they need, so that nobody has to feel like they have to turn inward and focus all their attention on making sure that their needs are met. And the prophets also remind the people that righteous indignation or anger is one of God's responses to the human violation of the covenant that God made with the people. And it grows out of God's love and concern for them in the same way that their righteous indignation and anger should grow from love and concern for others, for the other nations, for the way that they have been abused and manipulated by people who are trying to get power for themselves rather than looking to God. So these are all the messages that the prophets bring to the people as they try to, wrestle with the people and try to get them to kind of refocus their attention to what it is that God originally intended for the people of Israel. So questions, comments about that? Overwhelming amount of information.
Yeah. Boy, I don't know. I don't know.
I think it's a really good way to conceptualize salvation history. It makes a lot of sense.
Boy, I don't even know how to respond to that.
Well, you don't have to. If you want to still chew on it, I can keep going.
Sometimes these ideas that seem like they should be simple are so overwhelming that I just don't know.
Yeah.
Well,
All right. Well, why don't we just keep on chugging through, and maybe some things will
yeah,
be clearer as we move forward.
okay.
So now I want to shift just a little bit. This is still kind of within the development of the Jewish relationship with God thing, but I want to shift a little bit out of the biblical narrative and into just a quick overview of the tradition of the Messiah, because we call Jesus the Messiah, and that's an important buzzword within the Jewish tradition and understanding why Jesus would have been born a Jew. So the word that we translate today as Messiah comes from the Hebrew word that I put up here in the Hebrew, Mashiach. And Mashiach means anointed one. It has nothing to do with salvation necessarily. It's someone that has been chosen by God, anointed for a purpose. And so in the Hebrew scriptures, we have kings and prophets and priests being called Mashiach. We also have objects like the altar in the temple or certain vessels that are used in the temple cult being called Mashiach, the anointed things. And so it's an interesting word that the kind of the meaning of which has changed over the course of time. This is the moment that things, I think, really are shifting in an interesting way. In Isaiah chapter 45, verse 1, King Cyrus the Great of the Persian Empire is called the Messiah. In the history of the Jewish people, in 587, 586 BCE, they were defeated by Nebuchadnezzar, and the majority of the people were taken into exile in Babylon. And they remained there until 539, when the Persians defeated the Babylonians and took over their empire. So the transition of power from the Babylonians to the Persians. And Cyrus was the king of the Persians, and he changed the policy that Nebuchadnezzar had established, that people who were conquered, defeated militarily, were going to be moved. And the reason that he moved them was because if you're living in a place that's not your own, it's harder for you to revolt. It's harder for you to organize yourself because you're all mixed up with other people that you don't trust. You don't have the same language as them, those kinds of things. And so that's why that was done. But Cyrus gave permission for the Jewish people, the remainder of the people who wanted to return to their former homeland. He allowed them to return. And so Isaiah 45, because he allowed them to return and rebuild their city and rebuild their temple, Cyrus is called the Messiah, the anointed one, someone chosen by God to bring blessing to the people, to help the Jewish people. And so I think that's kind of where the connotation of savior starts to get attached to the Messiah. A lot of the later development of the concept of the Messiah happens within the intertestamental period, the period between what we have in our Old Testament and what we have in our New Testament, which is depending on where you date some of the books in the Old Testament, it's anywhere from 500 years to maybe 100 years. But in that period, but we can see a little bit of it in books like Daniel, the development of the concept of the Messiah as part of the apocalypse, as a part of the revealing of God's will, as a part of the shift from kind of how things are to how the God wants things to be in the future. And so we get Messianic apocalypticism developing. Some of what we see in Daniel is pretty pretty basic in terms of what you can see later, which is a lot more complicated. But the supernatural kinds of stuff, the Son of Man descending on a cloud, and the spiritual warfare and all that kind of stuff is pretty typical of that. And the idea that the Messiah is going to be the one to kind of bring all of this forward. And we talked about before that, in order to survive oppression, you have to have hope. And if you don't have any hope right now, then you will look to the future for that hope. And if you can't envision a better future for yourself by, realistic means, by political means, by military means, then you start to look elsewhere. You start to look for supernatural means. You start to look, to God for that outlet. And so when the people were experiencing generations of oppression from outside sources, from all these empires that kept beating them down, they started to look to their scriptures for hints about what the future might hold in terms of God's promises and when those promises might come to fruition. And so they would interpret and reinterpret passages in their scriptures depending on the current situation that they were in. And over the course of time, the concept of the Messiah became more and more spiritualized, added more and more supernatural elements. So originally, a Messiah was a regular old standard king. Like David was a Messiah. He was anointed by Samuel to be the king. But then eventually you get to this concept of the Messiah being some kind of otherworldly figure, maybe still a person, but having some kind of otherworldly power that will help us to overcome the overwhelming oppression of these outside empires like the Babylonians and the Greeks and the Persians. And so this kind of continues to develop over the course of time. And after we've talked about this a long time ago when we were talking about the book of Daniel, but the kind of moment of no return with all of this occurred in the year 167 BCE, when the Greek ruler who happened to, the Greek Empire happened to be in control of the region of Palestine at the time. His name was Antiochus IV. He was called Antiochus Epiphanes as a nickname. And he went to Egypt to try to conquer Egypt and get more land for himself and conquer his enemy in Egypt. And he failed. And on his way home from his defeat, he stopped in Jerusalem, and he was so angry about this defeat that he had experienced and so mad that these Jews continued to be a thorn in his side about their weird religion and their weird practices that he decided that he was going to ban Judaism. He profaned the temple, pretty much destroyed everything that could go on in there by slaughtering a pig on the altar, which is, just absolutely should not be done, cannot be done. And that sparked a revolt. Finally open military revolt. And that revolt was led by a man named Judas Maccabeus. And he won. They won this revolt. It's American Revolution level stuff, that there's this huge empire that has all these resources, and somehow this tiny little contingent of revolutionaries wins. And because of this, because Judas Maccabeus won total independence from an external power for the Jewish people, a lot of people at the time thought that he was the Messiah. He was the anointed one that God chose to lead them into the fulfillment of all these promises that they had gleaned from their scriptures. And this was the case until 37 BCE, which is when that dynasty called the Hasmonean dynasty that Judas Maccabeus established fell to the Romans. And so for about 100 years or so, the assumption was that this was it. This was our guy. Everything was going to be better now. God's will is going to be done. The everlasting peace that was promised in the scriptures has finally come. but then they realized that, oh, I guess it wasn't permanent, it was temporary. And so he could not have been a Messiah, because God promised that the Messiah's reign would be eternal with everlasting peace, and that's not the case. That's not what's happening here. And so we have to kind of reframe, reinterpret, re-understand what's happening and what's going on. So I wanted to read to you just a little bit of a summary of how the Jewish people historically have been taught to kind of look for the clues about who might be the Messiah. And so I want to read to you, this is actually written by a Jewish philosopher named Maimonides, and he didn't write much until much after this period in history. He's from about the 12th century, so in the Middle Ages, late Middle Ages, well, mid-Middle Ages, I guess. But what he says, I think, summarizes pretty well for us today what a lot of Jews have believed about the Messiah for a really long time. So I want to read this to you. It kind of gives you a sense of what what a Jew would have been looking for at the time. So he says, "And if a king shall arise from among the house of David, studying Torah, and which is the law, and occupied with commandments like his father David, according to the written and oral Torah, and he will impel all of Israel to follow it and to strengthen breaches in its observance," so religious adherence, "and will fight God's wars," so military dominance, "this one is to be treated as if he were the anointed one. If he succeeded and built the holy temple in its proper place," so reestablishment of the temple, "and gathered the dispersed ones of Israel together," so bringing all the people who have lived in diaspora, who are, of Jewish descent, whatever that means. We talked about how complicated that is earlier, together to one place. So this is where a lot of the Zionism kind of stuff comes in. "This is indeed the anointed one for certain, and he will mend the entire world to worship the Lord together." So you see, again, even within this this military and political understanding of the Messiah, there's still that spark, mend the entire world to worship the Lord together. So there's still that, yes, we're in this for that purpose of bringing that blessing to the whole world. It's not just for us, it's for everyone. We believe that our military and political dominance is for the best for everybody. But they're missing a little piece to that, I think, and we'll get to that in a minute. So stop there. Questions, comments up to that point?
Well, in the book, The Zealot, they talk about the Messiahs and how Messiah was a career goal. Being a Messiah was a career goal. And a lot of people went around proclaiming to be a Messiah. And that was why Jesus was always being asked, "Are you the one?" It ties in with the fact that it was hard for the people back then to know what was real or what was true. And I've always wondered if he didn't need to be a Jew because he was a thorn. He was upsetting the status quo and had to be like this rebel kind of person, that doesn't make sense. I don't know what I'm saying. It's just that the term Messiah back then was frequently used, and how they settled on the fact that he was the true Messiah, but the Jews didn't accept that and still don't. And I can understand that from the way you've just described that. But why are we so convinced that he is? And they,
That's a good question. Paul, the Apostle Paul, asked that question too. and didn't really come up with a good answer.
Yeah, it's kind of like why did the Jews, they got all this instruction and communication with God, and they didn't follow it to the end, you know.
All right.
So,
Well,
Well, I got a
Jim.
put on this. You said it right where the Jews don't think that Jesus was the Messiah. When you read all the lineage in the Bible, it seems to me now that they're trying to prove that he was by documenting all the lineage. And then somebody says, now, wait a minute. Joseph wasn't the father, okay? And the lineage goes through the man, not the woman, all right? So there is doubt right there off the bat. How can you say that he is the Messiah when by lineage there is no connection to David, right? So there's doubt right off the bat as they're writing the Bible. They're trying to prove right off the bat that this is the Messiah,
Yep.
and this is how we're going to prove it. But there is doubt now.
Yeah. And lots of other things too.
Right.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's shift gears again here now, and we're going to go now into the New Testament and talk about Jesus and how he does or doesn't fit into all of this. So we're going to switch back from that. I was using that complete Jewish Bible translation. We're going to switch back into our standard, New Revised Standard Version that we typically use. So after all this happens, Jesus arrives on the scene, and he is carrying the baggage of all this stuff, the thousands of years of Jewish history, Jewish theology, Jewish philosophy, and Jewish hope when Jesus arrives on our doorstep here with Matthew. And what he says explicitly that we, I think, as Christians often ignore or try to misinterpret or reinterpret is that the law and the prophets are part and parcel of what he's here doing. In Matthew chapter 5, he says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until it all is accomplished." So the question then is not, is Jesus in the line of God's relationship with the Jews? The question is, what is the law intended to accomplish? If the law will not pass away until it all is accomplished, what is the law intending to accomplish? What needs to be accomplished? What do you think? Based on what we've said so far.
that everybody lives in peace and takes care of one another and fulfill the task that God's given us.
Yeah. Be fruitful and multiply, right?
Mm-hmm.
Go back to the very beginning. And so Jesus isn't starting over. Jesus isn't, a figure that arises to reject the Jews or to reject what God has done in the past. Jesus is here, I would say, to refocus that covenant, to refocus that relationship. So, in what ways is he trying to refocus? I think that there are several different things that Jesus is trying to accomplish here, and I've picked out a few short verses for us to kind of take a look at examples of that. Jesus is here to point out where humans consistently go wrong in their relationship with God. And so, we're talking here about the Jewish people and their history with God. And then when Jesus shows up, he's speaking again to Jews. But I want us to be very careful not to think that this is just Jews and not the human condition, that all of us are this way all the time. The first place that I think Jesus is trying to refocus the covenant is in terms of removing our self-interest in favor of justice. And so I pulled out Matthew chapter 25, the famous story of the dividing of the sheep and the goats. And the king says, the reason why you are a sheep, that you're going to enter into my glory, is because you did all of these things for me. And then it says, the righteous will answer him, Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you? And the king answered them, truly, I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me. And so that reminder that the basics of our relationship with God, if we're Jewish because we're part of the chosen people of Israel, or if we are Christians and have been pulled into the covenant later, if you are a person of God, your job is not to accept that and gloat and say, yay me, I got this thing from God, I have this personal relationship with Jesus, aren't I awesome? The whole point of that is to use those blessings to turn around and bless others. And so where we go wrong is that we are self-interested. We think that we deserve something from God. We establish ourselves as the end point of God's blessings and God's relationship and God's reaching out. But that's not the case. The purpose of that reaching out from God, the purpose of those blessings, is for justice, for the establishment of good relationships between ourselves and others. Questions or comments on that?
This is a terrible time, I think, for churches to be dwindling in membership and attendance, because we need to all hear this.
But I think it's because we're not doing this. That's why that's
Yes.
happening, right?
Yeah. I think there's a connection.
Mm-hmm. And so secondarily, I think that Jesus, did I miss something? Oh, no, I'm good. Secondarily, I think that Jesus is also trying to point out to us that we consistently choose legalism over blessing. And I think it's kind of secondary to the first one, because it's still about self-interest. How can I get what is coming to me? How can I ensure that I've got everything that I need? Well, the easiest thing to do is to decide what God wants and do it. And then I've kind of covered all my bases, and then now I'm going to get my blessings from God. It's not about the sharing. It's not about the economy of justice and community. It's about my economic position. It's about the economics of me having what I want, what I need, making sure that I'm at the right standing, I'm at the right place. And so Jesus calls us out on that too. In Mark chapter 2, there's the story of the disciples on the Sabbath. And I cut out a little bit in the middle, but I'll fill it in and I'll tell you about it a little bit. So Mark chapter 2, verse 23. One Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields. This is Jesus. And as he and his disciples made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? And Jesus said to them, have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for any but the priest to eat. And he gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. And so we tend to, we don't understand that little story about David. And so we tend to just kind of pull that passage out. The Sabbath was made for humankind and not humankind for the Sabbath. And we interpret that in all kinds of different ways. But if we look at this within context, what Jesus is saying here is when there's a law that is established, the purpose of that law, the intention of that law is to bring that blessing, to establish that relationship with God, to deepen that relationship with God and those relationships with others. And so the bread of the presence is something that is part of that larger system. But the bread of the presence is not there so that we can create hierarchies between high priests and regular priests and common people and women and children and non-Jews. The bread of the presence is there to serve the people and to help to establish and maintain that relationship with God. And so if what the people need right now is not a religious ceremony, what the people need right now is literal food because they are hungry, then use the bread of the presence for that purpose. The Sabbath is a day that we're supposed to rest. We're supposed to spend time reflecting and enjoying each other's company and, working on our relationship with God. But if somebody is broken down on the side of the highway and you need to get out and help them to fix their pop tire because you have the ability to do that, or, if there's any human need that you see, then don't allow the letter of the law to impede you from understanding the spirit of the law. And I think that, again, like this is part of that stereotype of how Christians have understood Jews, and we're going to talk a lot more about that next week. But it's important for us to realize and understand and kind of have the self-awareness to know that we do the same thing. We just don't do it in exactly the same way. The Jewish people cling tightly to their law, and that's the capital L law. Some Jews will get too far into the weeds and talking about the laws. For example, they would, in ancient times, they would argue, they'd sit around and debate about how far you can walk in a day on the Sabbath before you have walked too much and it becomes work. And they figured out what that was, and then they would establish these little huts along the road, and anybody who needed to could call that hut their home, so that they could leave home, journey to the distance that they were permitted to journey in a day without it being called work. And then in their minds, they would say, okay, so that place back there is no longer my home. Now my home is this hut that's up ahead. And then they would they would travel toward that hut, and they would make it to the hut at the end of the day. And they would say, okay, well, I didn't violate the law because technically we have established together, how many miles away I can get from my house before I'm traveling and working. And I went that far and no further. But then instead of turning around and going back to my house, I kept going to my other house. And so that's okay. I can follow that. And so it just becomes this entangled mess that some people understand and some people don't. And the people who don't understand it are violating the law all the time. And we look down upon them because they're not real good Jews and, blah, blah, blah. And we can laugh at this. We can, ridicule for this. But think about all the ways that we do the same thing as Christians, that we create these arbitrary lines between ourselves and people who don't understand. Well, it's not quite as much like this anymore, but I remember when I was a kid, even until I was, in my 20s, if you wore jeans to church, oh my goodness, how dare you?
Really?
How dare you be so rude and, and violate God's honor in this way, to wear jeans to church. Any number of things that we come up with for reasons why, oh, you didn't say amen after you took your cup of wine. You aren't, you don't know what's going on here. You're not really worthy of being here. I mean, just all the silly things that we do to protect, to protect what we think God wants and we think religion is about. But it's not, the use of sanctuaries for things that are, going to dirty them up. I remember when I was a teenager, the youth group desperately wanted to go on this youth trip, and we wanted to throw like a spaghetti dinner or something in the church and ask people to pay to get into the spaghetti dinner so that we could make money to do this thing. And the church leaders not only did not let us do it, but ridiculed us, because the Bible says that it is not okay to gamble and sell tickets and have raffles and do all those types of things. And so we were asking them to violate the rules of the Bible in order to make money for ourselves. How dare we? So what do you think that did to us as teenagers? We wanted, what did we want? We didn't want to make money. We wanted to go on this trip. So if they didn't want us to have that dinner, they could have said, okay, well, let's sit down with you and talk a little bit about this and try to find another way to make this happen, because we don't feel comfortable with this based on our interpretation of the Bible. But those rules are not there to keep people from God in the way that we like to use them. The law is not a gate. The law is not a fence. But we are so good at making it that. We're so good at even just inventing our own rules that aren't even in the Bible to create that. And so Jesus, I think, from the interpretational lens that we're using today, Jesus kind of points those things out to the people of his time, and continues to point those things out to every generation who continues to behave in the same way. We choose self-interest over justice. We choose legalism over blessing every single day, every single generation. And Jesus is there to point that out to us, not to say you're terrible, you're worse than everybody else, but to refocus us, to point us back to the original purpose of that relationship that God made with the original people, with Adam and then with Abraham. Why all this stuff? So that we can be a blessing to others. So how do we use the law? How do we use the resources that we have? How do we use everything that we are to fulfill that, is what Jesus is asking of us, I think, within this. Questions, comments there?
Well, Jesus went out of his way to recognize poor people and sick people and women. And I mean, everything about his ministry demonstrated that everyone was equal and deserved to be blessed. And I don't know how we've gotten so far away from that definition of who is worthy of God's blessing. This whole thing, like thinking about the homelessness situation, it seems like it's so easy to say, if people really wanted a different life, they could have one. And I just think that those people have never really struggled to do anything. They don't understand how difficult it is when you're destitute to try to do anything. And if you don't have the means, if you don't have a cell phone, like for instance, I'm trying to get some services for my brother. He doesn't have a cell phone right now because I took him off of my plan, and I'm trying to get him set up on another one. But he's been trying to get some services, and he can't do that without a cell phone. Because
Yeah.
because his landline isn't available all the time for him if he leaves the house or whatever.
Mhm.
And so there's just, I think somebody mentioned it last night about how we just make assumptions based on our lives, and we don't even look at the things that other people don't have. They don't even have the basic things to try to be different. And Jesus always lifted those people up. We've just gotten so far away from that thing of, am I my brother's keeper? We've just gotten so far away from that.
Mhm.
It's
We're too
sad.
busy.
Or
We're too
maybe we're
busy.
still far away from it. I'm not sure there's ever been a time when we've done it right as
No.
humans.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
We're too busy judging.
Yes, absolutely. All right.
It's sad.
So
It's
let's
really-
come with some conclusions here. So first, I want to answer the question, why was Jesus not born a Jew? Because this is very important. I think we always have to tread very lightly and carefully when we're talking about Judaism and its relationship to Christianity. And next week, we're going to learn a whole lot more about why that is and what that history has looked like. But for today, I just want to talk quickly about why Jesus was not born a Jew. I think, first of all, Jesus was not born a Jew to usurp the Jews' blessing or status that God gave them. Jesus was not born a Jew to fulfill the entire purpose of the Jews' chosenness, so that, we can kind of assume that God gave up on the Jews, blessing the nations and being part of God's plan and being part of God's intention for the world. And so God, made Jesus rise up from among them so that he could kind of divert away from them. The Jews are still part of what God is trying to do in the world. God is still faithful to the covenant that God made with Abraham and with the Jewish people. That does not mean we can, this could go on all day. That doesn't mean that, everything that the nation of Israel is doing right now is right. But I think as Christians, we have to stand firm and say that God is with the Jewish people. God has not abandoned them in the way that historically Christians have stated. Jesus was not born a Jew so that God could transfer that blessing, transfer that chosenness to another group of people. God did not disinherit the Jews. God was not unfaithful to the covenant that God made with the Jews. God did not reconsider and make a different choice. Jesus was born a Jew because he fits within what God has always been doing with and through the Jewish people, not to change that. So big old X over those things. But then why was Jesus born a Jew? I think for at least two reasons. Reason number one is God's faithfulness, to show that God is faithful to those covenants and promises that were made even when the people who made them were not faithful. And not because, the Jews are bad, but because none of us can do it. None of us have ever kept those promises and fulfilled those covenants that we've made with God. Romans chapter 3 says, "But now, apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been disclosed and is attested by the law and the prophets, the righteousness of God through the faith of Jesus Christ for all who believe. For there is no distinction, since all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. They are now justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus." So God continues to be faithful. Jesus was born a Jew because God already made this statement and continues to fight for it, continues to be faithful to it. And then secondly, I want to say that Jesus was born a Jew because of God's intentions. Jesus was born a Jew to help us, to point out to us that we need to shift our perspectives back to the original intentions that God had for us. And that reminder, that nudge to shift our perspective is needed over and over and over and over and over again, because we all lose sight of it constantly. And so I bring to you 1 John chapter 4. Beloved, since God loves us so much, we also ought to love one another. No one has ever seen God. If we love one another, God lives in us and his love is perfected in us. So it's about those relationships with others. It's about God's intentions for us. It's about the reason why God created us and wants to be in relationship with us. Because as Dr. Stern said, God created the world good, but it is in the relationships with us and the relationships that we make with each other that it can be perfected. And then finally, I think that Jesus was born a Jew because of God's blessing, to be a blessing to the nations through the family of Abraham, as God promised. And so that we, when in receiving that blessing, can then bring it to others. So my last scripture for you today is Matthew chapter 28, verses 18 to 20. Jesus said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age. So why are we supposed to do that? Because Jesus has all the authority in heaven and on earth. Because God established who we are. God created us. God has sustained us. God wants that relationship with us. And the way that we fulfill our side of that relationship, the way that we deepen that relationship, is by reaching out to others. And in that, God will be with us. Relationship with God and relationship with others, I think, looks the same to God. So that's all I have for today.
Wow.
Very good.
That was enough. That was enough. Thank you.
Enough.
It just takes me so long to think through it, and I find myself thinking about it all the time after one of our conversations. It's like, well, why didn't I ask this question? Now I have this question. Now,
Well, that's why you send me the questions, and then we make a new section, a new question set.
really, it just goes on and on. I mean, and that's one of the reasons why I persist in coming, because I like to have to think like that. I think it's good for us to have to think about these things and figure them out.
This class definitely has had an immense impact on me and my faith and my understanding of these things. When I get these questions and have to do my research and think about them and think about what I want to say, I would say in the last year, with especially this particular study, has really given me a lot of shifts in my thinking.
Oh,
Yes,
yeah.
it has. Yes,
Yeah.
it has.
And that's why I think our group stays so small, is because some people aren't ready yet, or they don't understand where we are,
Mm-hmm.
And then you look at how it amazes me how we have not changed over the thousands of years. And so all this stuff written like 2,000 years ago is still applicable.
Yep.
And then we went to a couple of museums in December that made me realize our country is, we grew up in the Eisenhower years, which was really an oddity, because all this bad stuff has been going on forever. It's really not any different, except for the Eisenhower years, which I thought were normal, which were not.
Those years were unreal, Pam.
I know. And I just thought we'd get better from there, but no. Okay.
All
So-
right, so next week is not a continuation of this question, but it is, I think, has some implications as we continue to ponder this. Next week's question is, why have Jews been persecuted by Christians? We'll talk about the history of the relationship between Jews and Christians next week.
And that, does that include why they've been hated by different groups for so many, for thousands of years?
Yes, ma'am.
All righty.
All right.
Because I have
Okay.
never understood that.
Okay,
thanks
thank you.
all.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
Have a good week. Take care of
You too.
yourself.
Bye.
Bye-bye.